Assalamualaikum to everyone. Today we're going to proceed with the next element under law of contract, which is the element of consideration. Consideration is also important elements or requirement in order to form a valid contract. So this is the learning outcomes for today's lecture. First, we will start with a definition of consideration according to the Contracts Act 1950, followed by the 3 types of consideration, 5 rules regarding consideration, and last but not least, the vital part in a consideration itself, the general rule and its exception. Alright, so as an introduction, as we know that agreement alone does not make a contract. Even you have an offer, acceptance, but you still need considerations. So both parties need to provide consideration, either a promisor or the promisee. Each side must promise to give or do something for the other. For example, A, the promisor, promised to sell his car to B, the promisee. A's promise will only be enforceable by B as a contract if B has provided considerations, normally in a form of payment of money, but it could consist of some other service to which A might agree. So it depends on A's consideration. For example, that also can be a promise of a money payment or service in the future, and it can be regarded as a sufficient consideration. So there must be a sufficient consideration in order to conclude a valid contract. So in this situation, the promisee B has to give something in return for the promise of the promisor in order to have a binding contract. Okay, because for A and B to conclude the contract, okay, when A sell his car to B, B also must provide consideration. An example, in form of payment of money to A. Alright, now we continue with the definitions of consideration according to the Contracts Act 1950, based on Section 2, Subsection D of the Act, define consideration when, at the desire of the promisor, the promise or any other person has done or abstained from doing something, or does or abstains from doing, or promise to do or to abstain from doing something. Okay, this is promisee, not promise. Alright, when you go through this definition of consideration, we can conclude that consideration is the price of which one party to buy the promise or act of the other. In other words, something that is given in return for something else. Okay, you want to have something, but at the same time you must provide some consideration. Okay, consideration also can be regarded as a value given for a promise. Okay, then you give something in order to exchange for the promise. So consideration is important. Move on to the types of consideration. There are 3 types. First, we discuss on the executory consideration. It is a promise for a promise. In simple words, it is an exchange of promise to perform acts in the future. Okay, you want to have something, so you must provide something as well. For example, A agrees to sell to B a bicycle, and B agrees to pay 300 ringgit for it. So both parties here provide consideration. B's promise to pay 300 ringgit is the consideration for A's promise to sell the bicycle to B. And A's promise to sell the bicycle is the consideration for B's promise to pay 300 ringgit. What if B failed to provide consideration? In other words, B failed to pay for the bicycle. Whether he can get the bicycle? No. Whether there is whether there is a binding contract between them? No. In other words, B must give consideration in form of payment of money. Okay, RM 300 ringgit. Okay, example of case for the executory consideration. Wong Hon Leong, David against Nur Azman bin Adnan, 1995. In this case, appellant promised to pay respondent 268,000 ringgit plus in return for the respondent's application to convert and subdivide certain land to be developed into a housing estate. So when you scrutinize the facts of the case, appellants promise to pay to respondent, right? And then respondent's consideration is to convert and subdivide certain land. So the court held that the exchange of a mutual promise was good considerations. Both parties provide considerations. Therefore, there was a binding agreement between them, and the respondent's claim for the fee succeeded. In the end, you cannot say that there was no concluded contract because both parties already gave their consideration. Okay. Alright. The second types of consideration is executed. This is a promise for an act. When a promise is made in return for the performance of an act. For example, A offers 50 ringgit reward for the return of her lost handbag. If B finds the bag and returns it, B's consideration is executed. Why B's consideration is executed? Because B performed the act. So B made the consideration, or the consideration is coming from B. Whether B is entitled to claim 50 ringgit reward from A? Yes. Okay, because B's consideration is executed. In other words, he already provide considerations in form of an act. And A is liable to pay 50 ringgit reward to B. Okay, next. The other types of consideration is known as past consideration. Please bear in mind that past consideration is valid considerations. This is where a promise is made subsequent to and in return for an act that has already been performed. In other words, okay, a person already performed the act, but in future a promise was made to pay him, for example. This is known as past consideration. For example, a reward offer given after lost things are found and returned. So the promise to give reward to made in return for prior act. So this is different from the executed consideration because in executed consideration, promisor already announced the reward. Okay, the reward offer to other party. But in past consideration, act must come first. Okay, and then later there should be a promise made by the promisor. Okay, so later you may refer to section 2 subsection D and section 26 subsection B. There is one case to illustrate past consideration, Kepong Prospective against A.E. Smith. In this case, Smith, a consulting engineer, has assisted another in obtaining a prospecting permit for minor iron ore in the state of Johor. After the company was formed, An agreement was entered into between them, under which the company agreed to pay him 1% of the value of ore sold from the mining land. So based on these situations, we know that Smith already performed act on behalf of the company, where he managed to obtain the prospecting permit. And then later, okay, after that, the company enter into agreement, okay, where the company promised to pay him 1% of the value of ore. So, and this was consideration of the service rendered by Smith for the company prior to its formation. So, the service rendered by Smith before the agreement was made. So, this is considered as past consideration. So his service did constitute a valid consideration, so that Smith was entitled to his claim on the amount even before the agreement was made. So service provided by him before the agreement was made, and this is known as past consideration. Since past consideration is valid consideration, so he was entitled to claim the money from the company. Okay, next. We continue with the rules regarding consideration. Okay, there are 5 rules regarding considerations. The first rule is the consideration must be sufficient but need not be adequate. So, sufficient means it is freely given. Consideration must freely given without fraud. What is fraud? Fraud means when there is a cheating, okay, deceive, penipuan, misrepresentations is the false representation of fact, and any other vitiating factors, for example, undue influence. Okay, as long as the consent to the agreement is freely given, it is enough. So when we refer to this rule, we can say that consideration must be sufficient but need not be adequate. Okay, the amount of consideration is not important as long as the consideration is freely given. Example of case, Thomas against Thomas, 1842. Rent payment of £1 made by the plaintiff to defendant was a valuable consideration even though it was not adequate. Okay, we believe that £1 is not adequate, okay, but as long as the consideration was freely given, then it can constitute valid consideration. So this rule links us with the concept of adequacy of consideration. The question is, what is the amount of consideration that is sufficient for each promise? Is 10,000 ringgit an adequate or sufficient consideration to sell a house that is worth 400,000 ringgit? Yeah, the market price of the house is 400,000 ringgit, but the seller wants to sell it at 10,000 ringgit. Whether this is constituted as adequate or sufficient consideration. Malaysian courts will not assess whether a promisor has received adequate considerations. So our court will only look into the sufficiency of considerations, whether the consideration is freely given by the promisor. Okay, and according to Contracts Act, the adequacy of consideration itself is immaterial, so it is not so important. Okay. Right, later you may refer to explanation to an illustration F of section 26 to explain more on the adequacy of consideration. Okay, the second rule of consideration that it must come from the promisee or other person. Promisee here is referring to the other party. We have a promisor, okay, the other party known as promisee, and considerations also can come from other person. Example of case is Venkata Chinaya against Verikatamaya. 1881. In this case, a sister agreed to pay an annuity to her brothers, but her brothers provide no consideration for the promise. On the same day, their mother had given the sister some land, stipulating that she must pay the annuity to her brothers. When the sister subsequently failed to fulfill the promise, her brothers sued her. So the issue before the court is whether her brother can take action against her. Because in this case, okay, as we can see the facts of the case, there was no consideration provided by the brothers. But who provide consideration in this case? Their mother. What's consideration? When the mother agreed to give the sister some land, stipulating that she must pay the annuity. So in this case, the consideration not coming from the promisee, who is the brothers, okay, but from other person who is their mother. So the sister was liable on the promise on the grounds that there was a valid consideration for the promise even though it did not move from the brothers. Okay, so in this case, the one who provide consideration is their mother and the agreement is valid. Okay, the third rule regarding consideration is consideration must has some value. Okay, as I explained before, okay, according to its definitions of considerations, it is something that must has value. According to Colling against Godfrey, 1931, a promise had been made to pay a witness who was under an order to attend court whether this promise is enforceable. The promise was unenforceable because there was no consideration for it. The duty to attend was a duty imposed by law. Okay, so when a person appears as a witness, this is not considered as consideration because this is under a duty imposed by law. In other words, he must appear as a witness, not because of he is providing the consideration. Okay, the next rule, consideration must not be illegal and vague. So consideration must be legal, must be lawful, and then it must be clear. According to Scammell and a nephew against Austin, in this case, the defendant ordered a motor van from the plaintiff based on the statement that on the understanding that the balance of the purchase price can be had on high purchase terms over a period of 2 years. So these statements basically consist of indefinite meaning, vague meaning. The offer was so vague that it had no definite meaning. Further negotiations would be required before agreement could be reached. So the promise here is not valid. And last but not least, the rule of consideration is it must be possible of performance. For example, payment of money, transfer of land. So it must be possible of performance. Okay. For example, let's say someone said to you that, okay, I would like to give you 10,000 ringgit if you are able to discover the magic. Whether your consideration to discover the magic constitute as valid considerations. It may be impossible to be performed. Okay, how do we discover the magic? Okay, so it depends on the situation of the case. Okay, next we continue with the general rule and its exceptions.